Go ahead, stand in front of your chair, please. Thank you.
You may be seated. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I'm receiving stipulations that jurors are present in the department.
Yes, Judge, they are.
Yes, Judge.
Very well. Madam Clerk, please swear the jury.
Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to truthfully deliberate this case according to the evidence and the law of the
Opening statement.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Power, authority, and control. That's what this case is about. This case is about the defendant's desire for power and authority over his wife, Natalia Muntean, and his desire to control her. At its base, that's what you're going to find, and that's what brings us here today. The evidence in this case is going to show that on March 23rd, 2016, Officer Dan Kolar, around noon, was working in an undercover capacity on an auto theft task force, and he was on routine patrol in the area of Lyford and Gilbo in the city of Detroit, county of Wayne. Now this area is a vast kind of open field. I think at one point in time it had houses on it, but now it's just a very desolate area. He'll tell you that he was patrolling this area because it's often used for people to dump stolen cars and illegal drag races and things of that nature. So Officer Kolar is on routine patrol on this task force when he happens to see a newer model, 2007-ish, blue pickup truck backed into one of these vacant lots. Immediately, this seems suspicious to him. He'll tell you because sometime recently he had just recovered a stolen vehicle from almost exactly that same area. So Officer Kolar will tell you that he drives up to investigate. And as he's doing this, he stops about 10 yards away from this pickup truck. And a man comes out from the pickup truck and walks towards his car. And Officer Kolar will tell you that that man is the defendant, Radu Muntean. Officer Kolar will tell you that immediately he didn't feel like everything was all right, and that the defendant showed him a badge, a fugitive recovery agent badge. Now remember that Officer Kolar was undercover at this point, so he didn't look like a police officer. He wasn't driving a police vehicle, and he didn't have a police uniform on. So he'll tell you that the defendant came up, showed him this bag, and asked him for some gas, saying that he was out of gas. And Officer Kolar will tell you that he asked, "Oh, you're law enforcement." And he'll tell you the defendant nodded yes. They have a little bit of a conversation, and Officer Kolar will tell you that things weren't really adding up, and what are you doing out here? He'll tell you the defendant says that he had to pick up his girlfriend, who had just gotten beaten up. Officer Kolar will tell you that he asked the defendant for some ID. The defendant goes back to the truck, and at this point Officer Kolar says he can see the shadow of somebody in the passenger seat of the truck. Officer Kolar will tell you that the defendant comes back, gives him his name, and tells him that he has a CPL, a license to carry a gun, and that he has that gun. Officer Kolar will tell you that he takes the gun, and he immediately then puts the defendant into custody, because something's not adding up at this point. Officer Kolar will tell you that the defendant was dressed, not as he's dressed today. He'll tell you that he was dressed in jeans, a jacket, and a hat. And Officer Kolar will tell you that he noticed the defendant's hands were stained red, and that the same thing was on his pants and on his jacket. Officer Kolar will then tell you that he goes to the truck to see who's in the truck. And there he'll tell you he finds a woman, later identified as the defendant's wife, Natalia Muntean. He'll tell you that he finds Natalia with a swollen face, that she's bloody, and that she's barely conscious. She can talk, but just a little bit. At this point, he'll tell you that other units start arriving, EMS comes, a bunch of officers, and you're going to hear from most of those people. You're also going to hear from Natalia Muntean, the defendant's wife. On March 22nd, 2016, is when the assaults begin to happen that bring us here. Natalia will tell you that the day before this happens, she goes over to the defendant's house, and she's going to give you an insight into their marriage. She'll tell you that they were separated and they were living apart, and they had been living apart for about a year and a half. She'll tell you that they have a child together named Nadia. She'll tell you that the defendant was very particular about who Nadia was around, and she'll tell you that he wanted full custody of the child, even though they were still married. So Natalia will tell you that the day before, she went over to the defendant's house, and that she ended up taking some drugs. She'll tell you that her legs started to swell, and she asked the defendant to take her to the hospital. She'll tell you that he said, no, drive yourself. So she'll tell you that she did go to drive herself, and as she's driving there, her heart starts to race, so she calls 911. She'll tell you, long story short, the ambulance comes, they take her to the hospital, she's treated, but then she's also taken back to the Michigan State Police Post. She'll tell you that the defendant had to be called to come get her from the Michigan State Police Post, and that he was not happy about it. He was very angry that he had to come pick her up. He didn't have a car that day, so this would have been the 21st into the very early morning hours of March 22nd. He was very upset, very angry with her. And he was very angry with her, she'll tell you, for a whole bunch of reasons. She had been seeing other people in the time that they were separated, and he didn't like that. And there's a whole lot of stuff going on in their marriage that she'll tell you about that brings us here today. She'll tell you that she had been scheduled to go to Chicago for mental health treatment. She was going to check into an inpatient facility to get some help for some depression that she had. So she'll tell you that she dropped Nadia off at daycare. And Nadia was supposed to be at daycare all week. She'll tell you that on the 22nd, after she gets dropped off at her house and then she runs a few errands, she'll tell you that she ends up canceling going to Chicago, but the defendant then comes over later that day, around 6 p.m. And the plan, she'll tell you, was to go visit their daughter. So she'll also tell you that they live in Hazel Park, both of them. She'll tell you that as soon as she got into the defendant's car, that 2007 Chevy pickup truck, blue pickup truck, they began arguing. She'll tell you that at this point in time, the defendant hands her some pills. And he has pills of his own. She'll tell you that he takes those pills, but she doesn't. She'll tell you that he says that this is the only way out. She'll tell you that she holds on to those pills. She'll then tell you that he drives off after a stop at their old house. She'll tell you that she tries to get out of the car at one point, but he drives off, and so she can't. She'll tell you that as he's driving in a very deliberate direction, that he starts punching her in the face at a stop sign. She'll tell you that they continue arguing, and they're arguing about the coworker having come over. He didn't care. The defendant didn't care for that. She'll tell you that he was very angry. He then pulls out his gun. He's waving it around. He then aims and shoots her in the legs. I say legs, she'll tell you, because the bullet enters her left calf, goes through her left leg, enters her right leg, and stops in her right calf. She'll tell you that she remembers being in shock, in the smoke, and screaming. The defendant then drives them to this field at Lyford and Gilbert. Now, you're going to hear that Natalia was not suicidal when she got in the truck that day. She'll tell you that. She's also going to tell you about what happened to her in the field. For reasons which we'll get to, her memory is not exactly clear, but she does know certain things. She knows that the defendant beat her. He beat her about the head, her face. She suffers a fractured jaw. He beats her over the head with the butt of a gun. He chokes her. He stabs her with a knife in the leg. And she's handcuffed. She's handcuffed by handcuffs that he had to the seatbelt of the passenger seat of the pickup truck. She'll tell you at one point when they're in the field, she does take those pills that she held on to. She'll tell you she took them to ease her pain. She'll also tell you that the defendant makes a statement when she's expressing that she's afraid about what's going to happen. That he says, "Don't worry, I won't go before you." You're going to have an opportunity to see Natalia's medical records, the treatment when she does get rescued by Officer Kolar and the EMTs. They'll tell you what they saw. Again, she had a fractured jaw, gunshot wounds to the leg. She has multiple lacerations and abrasions. I also anticipate that you're going to hear the testimony of one of the doctors who treated her at St. John's where she was taken. She has a stab wound to her palm, which she's going to tell you she received when the defendant took out a knife and started stabbing her leg around the bullet wound, that she tried to stop him and caught her palm. She's going to tell you, you're going to see in the medical records rather, that there were drugs in her system. You're also going to see some statements from Natalia in those medical records, and she's going to explain to you why she made those statements. You're going to see in the medical records when she talks to the doctors on the 23rd, the same day that the defendant is arrested, the same day they're found in the field, she tells them it was a suicide pact. You're also going to see that Natalia made a statement to the police that same day. And in that statement, she told the police it was a misunderstanding. She's going to explain to you that at the time, she was worried about the defendant. She was protecting him, is what I think you're going to see. That at the time, she's the victim of domestic violence, and she wants to protect him. She's afraid for her daughter, that her daughter will grow up without a father, and so she's thinking about him and not thinking about what happened to her, what he did to her. The other witnesses that you're going to hear from, the EMTs, the responding officers, the doctor, evidence technicians who gathered evidence, took pictures of both Ms. Muntean and the defendant. You're going to also hear about some DNA, and there's a fingerprint in it. You're also going to hear from a therapist. You're going to hear from Ms. Muntean's therapist, who's going to tell you about an incident that took place back on March 11th, where Natalia and the defendant went in to her therapy session together, and Natalia had a black eye. The therapist is going to tell you that she asked Natalia what happened. And Natalia originally says, I tripped, I fell, I had a laundry basket, I fell. When pressed a little bit further, the therapist will tell you Natalia told her, no, it was in fact the defendant that punched her. The therapist is then going to tell you that when confronted that this had happened, the defendant flies off the handle. He ends up calling the therapist aggressive, and he acts in such a way that he made the therapist afraid, so much so that they had to shut down the behavioral facility. Based on everything that happened, as you heard when we selected the jury on Tuesday, the defendant is charged with 7 counts, 7 crimes in this case. And the first is assault with intent to commit murder. To prove that charge, I have the burden of proving that first, the defendant tried to physically injure another person, which means an assault. The defendant assaults another person. In this case, that person is Natalia Muntean. Second, that at the time he committed the assault, he had the ability to cause injury, or at least believed he had the ability. And third, which I think is going to be what I would ask you to pay attention to the most, and what I think is going to be one of the issues in this case, is that at the time he assaulted Natalia, he intended to kill her. And this is what we talked about. I'd like you to keep your ears open during the testimony. What we talked about during voir dire, during selecting the jury. How do you prove someone's intent? Listen to how the defendant did the things he did, what he said, how he did it, and all the other circumstances in this case. You also have to consider a lesser charge of assault with intent to do great bodily harm less than murder. The first two elements are the same. The third is different. So you will see that the evidence will show all of the circumstances that the defendant was attempting to kill Ms. Muntean. However, if you believe that he did not intend to kill her, but only meant to cause her great bodily harm, that's the second count, assault with intent to do great bodily harm. And what is great bodily harm? Great bodily harm is any physical injury that could seriously harm the health or function of the body. Interestingly, for great bodily harm, I don't have to show that there was an actual injury. If there was injury, you can consider it. And in this case, I think you'll see that there are ample injuries to prove both assault with intent to murder and assault with intent to commit great bodily harm less than murder. Count 3 is unlawful imprisonment. I have to show that the defendant knowingly restrained another person and that he did so under one or more of the following circumstances. So what does restrain mean? It means exactly what you think it means. It means to restrict somebody's movement or liberty without their consent. It doesn't have to happen for any particular length of time, and it can be related to, or not, the commission of other criminal acts. And he has to do it under one or more of the following circumstances. By means of a weapon or dangerous instrument, so in this case you're going to hear about the gun and the knife, and the person restrained was secretly confined, which means to keep the confinement or location of the restrained person a secret. And this, I think you'll see, is him driving her to this field. No one's going to know unless he wants them to know where they are. And interestingly, I forgot to mention when Natalia testifies, she's going to tell you that the defendant was on his phone, was on a phone, her phone and his phone, for a majority of the time in the field. They were in this field, you're going to hear, from somewhere around 7 p.m. until noon the next day. Natalia's going to tell you that she believes at one point someone came out to the field because the defendant was talking to them about some money. He had money that he wanted to get rid of. So I keep an ear open for that. Fourth, he's also charged with assault with a dangerous weapon. This one is clear. The evidence is going to show that the defendant either attempted to commit a battery. What is a battery? A battery is a forceful or violent touching that's done without consent, so hitting, punching, things like that. He either attempted to commit a battery or did an act that would cause a reasonable person to fear or apprehend an immediate battery. That when he did so, he intended to injure Natalia Muntean or make her fear immediate battery. At the time, he had the ability to commit a battery, and that he committed the assault with a pistol. So this count particularly applies to when they're in the car, he has the gun out, he's waving it around, like she'll tell you, and then he shoots her in the leg. Felony firearm. This means that when he committed one of the felonies that we already talked about, he had a gun on him. He possessed a gun. That's all that means. Aggravated domestic violence. This is count 6. To prove this, I have to show that the defendant assaulted and battered his wife, but at the time they were still married, or formerly married, and that they had a child in common, and that he caused serious or aggravated injury. This is different. It's a little bit different wording than the great bodily harm. A serious or aggravated injury is a physical injury that requires immediate medical treatment or causes disfigurement, impairment of health, or impairment of part of the body. It's a little bit different wording. Lastly, the defendant is charged with torture. To prove this charge, I have to show the defendant had custody or physical control over Natalia Muntean, and that he did so by using force or threat of force to confine her, by interfering with her liberty or to restrict her freedom of movement. That he exercised his physical control without her consent or without lawful authority to do so. And at the time that he had this custody or physical control over her, he intentionally caused her great bodily injury and or severe mental pain or suffering. When you get these instructions, the instructions have built in what those two terms mean, great bodily injury and or severe mental pain and suffering. There's a lot of words to them, so I won't go through them now, but great bodily injury basically means causing a serious impairment of a bodily function, which includes certain things, including loss or substantial impairment of a body function, serious visible disfigurement, bone fractures, bleeding, subdural bleeding, bruising, internal injury, etc. And lastly, I have to prove that the defendant intended to cause Natalia Muntean to suffer cruel or extreme physical pain or mental pain and suffering. I don't need to prove that she actually suffered any pain. But I think the testimony that you're going to hear is that she did. She suffered greatly and continues to do so. There's going to be several times during this case when you ask yourself, why did she stay with him? Why didn't she do this? Why didn't she do that? Remember, just like we talked about, Ms. Muntean is not on trial. You're going to have those questions, but she is not on trial. The defendant is on trial. And because the defendant did each of these things that you're going to hear about, each of the things that we've talked about, and because the evidence is going to prove each of those counts beyond a reasonable doubt, at the end of this trial, I'm going to ask that you find him guilty of each and every one of those 7 counts. Thank you.
Opening statement, defense.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The prosecutor's right about a lot of things procedurally that happened in the trial. And some of you, when we went through jury selection, have served on juries before, others have not. With all due respect to Madam Prosecutor, the main issue that I have with what she said is that intent may be a factor in this case. Well, this case is built on intent. And you know as well as I do, there's no way that one human being can get inside the head of another human being. So when you deal with intent, you have to use all the factors that are available. And the person that sits in this chair, whether it be a police officer, evidence technician, medical personnel, therapist, or the complaining witness herself, the attention that you pay to that individual will build, in your mind at least, whether the intent is there. Whether my client had the intent to commit murder. This is all going to be a lengthy process. I will show you the utmost in respect by not asking questions that are repetitive or just for the sake of asking a question. I promise you that. You're going to have to ingest a lot of information. But at the core of all the information you hear, and all the witnesses that are sitting in this chair, and all the documents, and all the pictures that are entered into evidence, you're going to have to decide in the back of your mind what was the intent of this gentleman. I prefer, instead of me standing up here and telling you what witnesses are going to testify to or what they're not going to testify to trust your intelligence. That's why we selected you as a juror, of what this person says. Now, there has been people that have come before me that are much smarter and have spent literally millions of dollars to calculate how a jury makes up their mind and how they come to a decision. And it's not a flashy suit, it's not a PowerPoint presentation. Time after time after time, it comes down to, you ask a juror, how did you make your decision? What was it based on? And it comes down to what this person testifies to. Do you believe what they say? Is everything as it seems? And again, Madam Prosecutor, with all due respect, she's absolutely right. It is her burden to prove this, each and every element. We talked about this early on when we were selecting you for this jury. It's about elements. Each element must be met. Each element must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Or you're duty bound to come back with a not guilty verdict. That's plain and simple. He's presumed to be innocent at this point, And I believe that once you hear the testimony, particularly of the complaining witness, as well as her therapist, which I should go further, I'm not positive on how many therapists will be called. I'm assuming it's one at this point. But we will get into a history of mental illness, a history of drug abuse, a history of volatility. And these all factor into the intent. And all I'm asking for you to do is keep that in the back of your mind as you start to build this. Because what you're going to do, inevitably, is build a scenario in your mind of what happened. Best thing you can do is pay attention and come together as a group and figure out, based on what we've heard, based on what we've seen, is the intent factor there? Are all the elements there that are needed to convict on one charge or on two charges? And that's all I ask, just to have an open mind and to always remember in the background the elements of each charge, but most important is the intent of Mr. Muntean. Thank you very much.